It's incredible just how much cut content Silksong has for us to pick apart. Throughout this series, we've already looked at some of the bigger pieces of cut content, but there are plenty of smaller things hiding in the game's files that I think are just as interesting. From unused cutscenes and strange events, to things that give us a glimpse at how certain parts of the game could have played out, these little discoveries give us a better idea of just how much Silksong changed during development. So today, let's take a look at some of the little things cut from Silksong. We're going to start off with this cinematic, which would have played after Hornet was captured and taken to the slab. Every cutscene in Silksong is absolutely breathtaking and adds so much to the game's story, which makes it especially interesting to see that at least one of them didn't make it into the final game. The video's metadata reveals that its last edit was on July 31st, 2025, only a few short months before the game's release. With that in mind, it's possible that this cinematic went unused due to time constraints. Interestingly, this is also the only cinematic in the game that doesn't have a matching audio file. It's no shock that Silksong has some of the most fun bosses in the Hollow Knight franchise, but what about a throwback to the original Hollow Knight? Sprites that remain within the game's files suggest that at some point, Hornet would have fought Hive Queen Vespa, rather than us only seeing the final few strikes before the dialogue begins. What you're seeing on screen is Insane Rogue's attempt to bring Vespa's animations back to life. And from the looks of it, this could have been a fantastic boss fight. Unlike many of the other things in this video, I strongly believe we'll be seeing more of Vespa in future updates. The Weaver Burial Spires, the resting place of many weavers awaiting Pharloom's savior, contain a few disabled effects that certainly would have elevated the game. The first is an effect titled Weaver Spire Shield, a rune that would activate whenever an enemy got too close to a weaver's corpse. Essentially, it was a giant bug zapper. The second appears in the reveal trailer, a much stronger version of the binding effects. Now, at first glance, you might be wondering why I say these effects would have elevated the game. After all, they're just a few visual effects. Well, throughout Silksong, we learned that the Weavers were full of themselves. Through Weaver effigies, we know that bugs who travel to Pharloom revere them as divine figures. So it would make sense that, given this almost divine status, the Weavers would have done everything they could to ensure their sacred resting places remained unharmed. And as for the stronger binding effects, they're just cool. Save flags are essentially variables stored in Silksong's save data that keep track of whether certain events or conditions have occurred in your game. They would allow the game to remember things like whether you've completed a quest, defeated a boss, or triggered a particular event. But what makes them interesting for cut content is that developers can leave unused flags behind, even if the events they were meant to track never made it into the final game. And that's exactly what we see with two particularly interesting flags. One suggests that the Marrow was invaded by Scar, while another, alongside unused scare sprites, suggests that pilgrims were once meant to invade the Flea Caravan. It's such a shame that these two didn't make it into the final game. Pharloom's world building is wonderful, but I think it could have benefited from a little more dynamic change throughout the adventure. Act 3 is a great example of this. Seeing an area you've already visited transformed by the events of the story makes the world feel like it's actually moving around you. But I think Silksong could have used more smaller scale events like these, little changes that make Pharloom feel less static as you progress. The Caravan Invasion in particular would have been a great way to accomplish this. The caravan is supposed to be traveling through a dangerous, hostile kingdom, yet it's largely untouched by the dangers surrounding it. Having it actually come under attack would have made it feel much more like a real part of the world, rather than a safe hub that's protected by a bit of plot armor. If we go back to the reveal trailer, you'll notice that alongside strands of silk, the bug's hornet strikes also bleed. Most bugs have this purple blood, while the Scar have red blood and Moss Mother has green. I wouldn't be surprised if other bosses or tribes, like the Craw, had their own unique blood colors as well. Unfortunately, this trailer doesn't really show them off all that much. And while this might seem like a pretty minor detail, I think it could have been a really cool piece of world building. Hollow Knight and Silksong do a great job of making their different creatures feel distinct, and little details like this can go a long way toward reinforcing that. It also makes you wonder just how many different kinds of blood we might have seen throughout Pharloom. Maybe there would have been quests or materium related to it. The Second Sentinel went through quite a few changes during development, particularly when it came to its story and where we would have fought it. Their original area appears to be this massive hallway, complete with a really cool lighting setup. Ultimately, the arena we fight the Second Sentinel in makes a little more sense thematically, but I can't deny that this version has a lot more visual impact. A sprite also suggests that the way we would have awakened the Sentinel was completely different. Instead of solving puzzles within the Citadel, Hornet would have found it tangled amongst the roots of Shellwood. And that raises an interesting question. What exactly was the Second Sentinel sent out to do? We know that the Sentinels were entrusted with protecting the Citadel, but if this one was found deep within Shellwood, tangled in its roots, perhaps its original purpose was something more than simply guarding the Citadel. The Needolin may have originally had a much more interesting connection to the Weavers. There are remnants in the game's files suggesting that Hornet would have obtained the Needolin from a Weaver burial spire within the cut Weave Nest area. Doing so would trigger a unique memory sequence, with leftover code then pointing to Weave 04, a location that appears to have been the top of another Weaver burial spire in the old Weave Nest. What makes this even more interesting is some unused dialogue from Lace. After Hornet wakes up from the memory, Lace talks about finding Hornet asleep among the remains of her Weaver ancestors. She also mentions that curiosity is what brought her so far beneath the kingdom. There's even evidence that Lace may have been fought here. Leftover code references a Needolin fight involving Lace in Weave 04. If that fight really did take place in Weave Nest, then Lace's encounter in the Deep Docks may have originally happened here instead. So while we can't say for certain what this entire sequence would have looked like, it seems like the original Weave Nest had a much bigger role in Hornet's connection to the Weavers. And honestly, getting the Needolin from a place surrounded by the remains of her ancestors sounds like a pretty fitting way to introduce it. The Haunted Bellheart sequence may be one of the most fascinating parts of the game. I had seen and talked about Bellheart during Silksong's development, but not once did I expect this would be its introduction. Interestingly, there are unused assets for a very similar scene known internally as the Raptured Citadel. We don't know exactly what this scene would have been used for, but its connection to the Haunted Bellheart sequence suggests that something similar may have happened to the Citadel at one point. Even more interestingly, the scene seems to be connected to Lace, and is disabled after Hornet encounters her in the Coral Chambers. This could mean the Raptured Citadel was once part of a cut Lace sequence. We don't know exactly what happened here, but the idea of walking into the Citadel and finding it completely raptured is pretty terrifying. Okay, this one is brutal. There are unused versions of the ending cutscenes for the Old Hearts bosses that show Hornet doing something a little more hands-on. Instead of the fight simply ending, Hornet would apparently rip the heart straight out of each boss herself. I have no idea why this was cut, but honestly I kind of wish they kept it. It makes Hornet feel a lot more ruthless, and there's something incredibly satisfying about the idea of her just reaching in and taking the heart herself after Khan made me go through his gauntlet 20 times. It's definitely a lot more violent than what we ended up getting though. And finally, we have some more Cut Weaver memories that give us a glimpse into how much their story may have changed during development. One of them appears to show the Weavers playing harps and producing songs for Grandmother Silk. The harp from this unused scene was actually reused for the memory we see during the Widow fight. Another memory features Weavers working around a workshop table alongside a servitor ignum. This one may have been an earlier version of the Needolin memory, from before Hornet obtained it by binding Widow. And then there's a particularly strange one involving Widow's backstory. In this version, her mask would be removed while Silk was pinned down around her. Some of the sprites for the Silk Siphon machine in Whiteward are also labeled with the same internal name used for Widow's memory. However, we don't actually know if the machine was part of this memory. It's possible the developers simply reused Widow's sprites as a template, causing the same label to carry over. Still, it's really interesting seeing all these little pieces left behind. They show that the Weaver storyline went through quite a few different versions before we got the one in the final game. And the last one is probably the most brutal. Seeing Widow with her mask completely removed, with Silk pinned down around her, is genuinely disturbing. It's such a different image from what we ended up seeing, and it makes you wonder just how much darker the original Weaver storyline was supposed to be. What I love about this kind of cut content is that even the smallest leftover sprite, line of dialogue, or unused event can tell us something about how the game changed during development. Some of these ideas probably weren't needed, while others are things I genuinely wish had made it into the final game. But either way, it's fascinating to see these little pieces of Silksong that were almost completely forgotten. My name is Ari. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more Silksong content. I'll see you all next time.